Hello and welcome again to the 10th Bendigo Innovation and Invention Festival. My name's Jonathan Ridnell and welcome to today's conversation, Opportunities for Australian Regional Manufacturing. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival is coming to you from Bendigo in Victoria, Australia, and we're on Dja Dja Wurrung land. I'd like to pay respects to the traditional owners who are the first scientists, technologists and innovators who for thousands of years have been stewards of their culture and land. I'd like to particularly pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge this session's partner, Bendigo Pottery, and our contributors, Idea Spies, Australian Manufacturing Growth Centre, the Australian Industry Group and Ostmine. As we start day 2 of the festival, I still want to get a feel for who's participating around the traps. So you should be watching with a box on the right-hand side of your screen that says type a question. Can you send me a shout out, please? I'd love to see your name and where you're from. It'll be lovely to meet you all and to know where you are from too. Yesterday, we had someone tuning in from Denver, Colorado, from London, from San Francisco. So whether you're close, around the corner or international, say g'day right now. Now, to officially welcome us to today's sessions, Federal Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, the Honourable Karen Andrews, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. I wish I could be there in person, but in 2020 I'm becoming accustomed to relying on the magic of technology to speak at events like yours. Technology, of course, is at the heart of this festival. It's exciting to see so many businesses using this opportunity to come together, to build a community and showcase the important role of technology in regional areas. Australia's regional cities, including Bendigo, are a great source of innovation, and events such as this are a perfect opportunity to hear how businesses are innovating in their day-to-day operations. Of course, these are extremely tough times for all Victorians and Victorian businesses, but we've all been buoyed by the stories of hope and inspiration. The incredible resilience we've seen from Australian businesses and industry during this COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted what innovation is really about. Doing things differently to achieve better outcomes. It applies to every business across every sector. Indeed, one silver lining from this crisis has been that we've been forced to be more innovative. It's forced us to embrace technology and a different way of thinking. Many small and medium-sized businesses have used technology and digital innovations to continue and in many cases transform their operations. Innovators are not only helping solve health problems, but are also working to create more resilient industries in Australia. Businesses and entrepreneurs are doing this by improving their supply chains, building more responsive data and analytic capability, supporting more flexible working arrangements, and scaling up local capabilities. Many Victorian companies have put innovation into play by supporting Australians through the COVID-19 crisis. A great example is a company just down the road from Bendigo, Medcon, based in Shepparton. Medcon, with government assistance, has upgraded its machines, increasing its surgical face mask making capabilities, and is now employing a total of 98 staff at their Shepparton facility. Others, like Cletts Linen, a family-owned Victorian business, has become the first Australian manufacturer to move from making linen products to producing thousands of surgical gowns for frontline medical workers. The Australian government invests in a range of programs that help people explore, develop and commercialise their ideas. The Entrepreneurs Program, for instance, can help businesses to bring novel products, processes and services to market, to access the latest technology, knowledge and research to innovate and remain competitive, and to connect with business advisors who are experts in their respective fields. We know that innovation is key to the success of businesses and communities throughout Australia, including in Bendigo. The government looks forward to working with all of you as we navigate these challenges and get through to the other side stronger. Thanks again for this opportunity and best wishes for the festival.
Thank you so much, Minister Andrews, and we do appreciate the kind words coming from you. And we'd also like to continue to welcome people. My screen's gone crazy with the shout-outs, so if I miss you, it's because you've been on and gone so quickly. But April from Denver, Colorado, good morning. Paul Chapman, our chairman, thank you very much for tuning in. Victor says, hooray from Port Melbourne. Colleen, hello from Bendigo. John's from Bendigo. Did I mention Stuart from Dunedin in New Zealand? Karen from St Arnaud, Dean from Bendigo. So again, a truly international group here today to talk about the future of regional manufacturing. Well, yesterday we discussed the role of optimism as a driving force in innovation. We also learnt more about the link between realistic optimism and innovation, and the importance of nurturing creativity to encourage invention and innovation across our whole communities. We also touched on some of the key points from Greater Bendigo's brand new economic development strategy and the importance of creating a whole of community picture for a strong future together, from early childhood to education, meaningful jobs in strong business, and vibrant heritage and natural assets. Well, this morning I want to drill right down into one of those areas, regional manufacturing. And remember, we're not just a virtual festival, we're an interactive festival. So remember to use that ask a question or type a question box that you just did for the shout out to ask a question and contribute to 2020 BIIF. Our keynote presentation will be made by Innes Willix. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Industry Group. And Innes, I'm making a very dangerous assumption that since we're speaking at an invention and innovation festival with a theme based around optimism, I think you might be sharing some positive thoughts about opportunities for manufacture in regional areas. Innes, welcome to the program.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you to everyone from Dunedin to Colorado to St Arnaud to Bendigo to Melbourne and wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. And indeed, this is a time of challenge, but it's also a time of great optimism and good reason to be optimistic. We'll get through this and we'll get to the other side, and I'll come back to a little bit on that in a minute. I'd just like to thank the organisers of the festival, particularly Paul Chapman. Paul I know well, and he's done a great job promoting Bendigo as a manufacturing, as an industry hub, and with his turntable company, he's done a fantastic job going global from Bendigo, and it's an example to all of us that there are great opportunities no matter where you are and where you sit. Paul is also a great Collingwood man, so at the risk of everyone turning off for the next half an hour, go Pies, Paul. As I said, Jonathan, this is a time of optimism. It's also a time of challenge. But out of this challenge will come a reimagining and a rethinking of how Australia does business and the role of industry in it. We just heard from Karen Andrews, the Federal Industry Minister, and I've been involved in several roundtables with Karen over the past couple of years, and most particularly in the past few months, as well as other work through the National COVID Commission's Manufacturing Task Force, headed by Andrew Liveris, looking at the future of industry in Australia. And if there is one big takeout that I'd give you today is that industry is back and in a big way. It has the attention of policymakers, both in Canberra but also in Spring Street, perhaps in ways that it hasn't had for a long time. There's been a recognition through this pandemic and the devastation that it's caused that industry has stood up and industry has made an enormous difference to our economic stability through this time, but it also is the platform on which we can build recovery. Now, you've heard a lot around words like resilience and reshoring and rebuilding over the past few months when it comes to industry. Even words like self-reliance are used frequently. What that is telling us is that there is a real intent, still to be delivered, of course, but a real intent to rebuild and build up our manufacturing base in Australia. Some of the great lessons out of the pandemic thus far have been that we have lacked capability. We've had big gaps in supply chains. We've had an inability to get things done quickly. Also, there's been a clear recognition that perhaps our policymakers, quite frankly, didn't know as much about industry as they thought they did. The fact that they've recognised it is a very positive thing and something that we can work with from here. But industry, manufacturing in particular, is being talked about in ways that it hasn't been done before, and that alone should give us great cause for optimism. Now, the devil will always be in the detail, and the devil will always be in the development of policy that allows industry to flourish and decisions made by governments around what sectors to pursue, how to pursue them, what we should make here, what we can make here, and how we can do it. All of those are still to be worked out, but at least they're conversations that are being had now that weren't being had before. Today is also an opportunity to talk about what the future looks like in terms of innovative capacity in Australia. And Australia is far more innovative than we give ourselves credit for. Where you are, or where this conference is in Bendigo, is perhaps one of the great original hubs of innovation in Australia as a result of the gold rush of the 1850s, and some amazing inventions came out of that that are still used to this day. But a centre like Bendigo is fascinating because it has had always a connection between industry and the community, driven through mining, but spawning from that a whole range of other industries. And Bendigo remains very much an industrial base. Its proximity to Melbourne also gives it enormous opportunities, both as a market for product, but also as a supplier of product to Melbourne and beyond, through the Port of Melbourne to the world. And Bendigo, as one of the sort of great regional industrial centres, has been taking advantage of that. The influence and impact of industry in regional centres is far greater than it is in urban centres. The proximity to the workforce, the proximity to other suppliers, the proximity to education and other public institutions really makes industry in regional centres vital to their core and to their being. And Bendigo is a great example of that. So what I thought I'd do is start with is where we're at today. Today is the 1st of September, and on the first working day of every month, the Australian Industry Group puts out what's called the PMI, the Performance of Manufacturing Index. So this is the latest up-to-date information, real-time information around what's going on in the manufacturing sector. We do likewise for services and construction through the rest of this week. Today's figure for manufacturing nationally was 49.3, 50 being the point between contraction and expansion. That tells us that that things are relatively stable, but there's not enormous growth. We saw, obviously, when the pandemic hit, a huge decline in activity, dropping well down into the 30s. We had the steepest, most precipitous decline through April and May in the history of the PMI, back since it was first recorded in the 1990s. The shock was brutal and it was quick. Since then, we have generally seen a stabilisation and then some signs of a recovery going on in manufacturing and in industry more broadly, which is a positive thing. But that quick drop meant that we went to a lower base, and we're building off that lower base. That number of 49.3 was a national figure. The figure for Victoria is 44. And the rest of the country is expanding when it comes to industry and manufacturing. Victoria is in a contraction phase, and it's quite obvious to see why when you have Melbourne in lockdown and parts of regional Victoria in stage 3 lockdown. Obviously, activity is going to be curtailed, and I'll happily come back to that later. But clearly, Victoria is running at a different speed to the rest of the national economy. You could argue, and those in Canberra do argue, that we're really running now a 3-speed economy. Western Australia has pretty much got back to pre-pandemic consumption levels and growth. One figure I like to use for Western Australia is that sale of alcohol and food at venues is up 40% from before the pandemic now, which tells you that WA is sort of heaving, as it were. The rest of the country, apart from Victoria, is pottering along and doing okay, getting out of the pandemic slowly but surely. Border closures are holding things up, and you're hearing a lot about those. but the rest of the country is sort of finding its feet, and Victoria is still in some trouble. And Victoria being a quarter of the national economy, accounting for over a third of the jobs growth in the past 5 years, is doing it tough. And that is going to be a drag on the rest of the economy. This is where opportunities for regional centres like Bendigo really come to the fore. You see a lot of it in the real estate pages around people generally looking, if I can put it this way, to get out of Melbourne and looking for opportunities elsewhere. These are people with skills and with ambition, and they're looking to come to regional centres to contribute. And regional centres need to have either the industry or the capacity to develop entrepreneurial skills to allow these people to flourish. And I think you'll see quite clearly a population wave pushing out of Melbourne into regional centres in the years ahead. Melbourne is also suffering from a lack of migration. In fact, all of Australia is suffering right now from a lack of migration. And the migration that you may see is more likely to be internal than from external sources in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is an opportunity for centres like Bendigo to take advantage of that and to really drag people up from Melbourne and around. So that's an opportunity for Bendigo in a big way. Bendigo and Australia more generally, as I mentioned, are manufacturing centres. Just a quick snapshot of where manufacturing has been in Australia. Manufacturing in May this year, so when we were going into the dip, had 48,000 employing businesses that employed 852,000 people in manufacturing. That's directly. 48,000 businesses, 852,000 employees. And the wages paid in manufacturing were 9.5% of non-farm businesses in Australia. Manufacturers invested $9.8 billion in capital equipment in the year to June, which was about 8.5% of private sector capex. And export earnings were, in the year to June, were $124 billion. That tells you that manufacturing continues to be a key contributor to the Australian economy. And as I said, the focus on industry and manufacturing going forward will only be greater. What we've seen, though, is big changes in manufacturing over the past decade and even beyond that. It's come from a couple of sources. The growth of China has obviously impacted on manufacturing in Australia, manufacturing capacity, and manufacturing as a source of goods for others within Australia as well through supply chains. The China growth has been perhaps the greatest economic disruption, if I can call it that, in modern economic history. It has fundamentally changed the way the world does business. Now, no matter what happens going forward, China will continue to be a strong source of goods and material for Australia. But what you are seeing is Australian businesses coming out of the pandemic seek to shift risk, seeks to shift supply of material to broader sources, some to other markets internationally and some within Australia. And we saw clear signs of that reshoring or shifting back to Australia through the February-March period when China first went into the pandemic. The trick here for Australia is to continue that process and that progress, to diversify risk, but to do as much as we can here. Not everything, because we're never going to be able to do everything here, but to do as much as we can here. And the examples that Karen Andrews just gave around Medcon in Shepparton are great examples of how businesses are able to adapt and to be significant contributors to our economic well-being. And that is the challenge that we're all facing at the moment, and we're all trying to work through what to do. We saw also in the past decade and beyond the rise of the mining sector, which has had obviously a distortionary impact on our economy. The rest of our economy has reduced in size if you look at Australia as a pie, as the mining sector has grown over the past 2 decades or so. And that's had an impact on things like wages as well, skills, all those sort of issues, which have then worked their way through to manufacturing. Mining has also provided an opportunity for industry to contribute into the mining supply chain and pipeline, but it has a big impact and a big sort of, as we would say in economics, a distortionary impact on the economy as a whole. And then, of course, we saw the end of the car industry in Australia, which also played out and changed the face of manufacturing in the country in a very significant way. In fact, now the production of food and beverages is the biggest single source of manufacturing in the country. It accounts for about 25% of manufacturing in Australia is in the area of food and beverages. That always surprises a lot of people, but you think of food processing and packaging and the like. That's a big part of industry these days. Let me just talk a little bit around manufacturing more generally. We talk ourselves down. It's a big Australian attribute that we have, the tall poppy syndrome, but we have some magnificent manufacturers of scale and size in Australia. You can think of those I mentioned in traditional, those sort of companies in traditional manufacturing like plastics and metals and fertiliser. They might be production of bricks and tiles, cement and wood products. They might be CSL, which is Australia's largest listed companies and one of the world's top 10 biotechs. It is a manufacturer. We have a company like Ego Pharmaceuticals now exporting to over 30 countries in skincare and sunscreen products out of Melbourne. It might be a company like Amcor, which is the world's largest packaging company. Might be Ansell or Aurora, or it might be Volvo making trucks here in Australia. Now Australia's biggest vehicle manufacturer is Volvo up in Queensland. It could be the major agribusiness or niche science-based technology, textile companies. And as I mentioned, we've got cosmetics companies. We have companies playing and working in the high-tech areas of the defence and space industries, as we heard earlier. We've got our mining equipment businesses, which are world leaders, working off the back of the mining industry in Australia. And I'm only just beginning. We have a lot to be proud of in Australia. We have a lot to be optimistic of, and we have a lot that we can work from here to develop capability and capacity. You often hear people say, we don't make anything anymore. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we should always keep in mind that we are still a great manufacturing centre. We need and can do more and can do better, but that's the opportunity that COVID presents to us now. Now, talking about Bendigo itself, Bendigo is a great manufacturing hub and great centre. And I was talking to Jim Danick, AI Group's man in Bendigo. We've had a presence in Bendigo for a very long time, and Jim is very proud of the manufacturing capability that comes from Bendigo. Bendigo manufacturing in the greater Bendigo area has about 3,800 employees. That's about 8% of total employment. Manufacturing pays about $275 million a year in wages in Bendigo. $275 million. That's about 8% of total wages and salaries. It has output. Manufacturing has output from Bendigo of $2.5 billion. That's 16% of total output. And regional exports from manufacturing equate to about $1.1 billion, which is over a quarter of total exports from the greater Bendigo region. And with value add of about $425 million, that's 6% of the region's total. Whichever way you look at it, manufacturing is a substantial sector in Bendigo and only has opportunities to grow and diversify further. So I'll name some big names, and if I miss you, I'm sorry, I can't get to you all. It's a long list, but you think of Thales, which developed the Bushmaster and the Hawkeye military vehicles based in Bendigo, and many of its suppliers are based around regional Victoria. You've got Don KRC, which is part of the George Weston Food Group, which employs 1,400 people. Hazeldene's Chickens and Chicken Farms, which employs over 800 people. Larky Flour Mills, Keach Castings, Ridley Corporation just recently opened its $47 million feed mill in Bendigo, producing 350,000 tonnes of feed annually for poultry and pig farms. A great regional success story. And of course, Paul's Australian Turntable Company. So manufacturing has a great presence in Bendigo, and it is a wonderful base from which further growth can be generated. Now, it would be remiss of me if I was talking to you now and I didn't talk about what the current circumstances are that we are facing now, and some solutions to those, some causes for optimism as we look forward and project forward into the year or two ahead. AI Group has just released a series of what we are calling the post-pandemic policy papers. These are 9 different papers looking at policy solutions to the problems that we currently face as a result of the pandemic. And in one of them, looking at industry development, we look at the sort of things government can do. We're not looking for huge interventions into industry policy, but we do argue that there is a very strong case to build the capabilities of our businesses, particularly our SMEs, and to help high-growth industries and innovative businesses grow even faster, and to generally back innovation across the economy. Innovation is a word that is sort of back in vogue now. It was out of style for a while there, but it's back in vogue, and it is being pushed very hard within policy-making circles. In particular, in that connection, I'd like to call out the Victorian Government's Regional Manufacturing Cluster Program. Now, I haven't exactly been a big fan or singing the praises of the Victorian Government in recent weeks on a range of issues related to the pandemic, and I'll continue to push that. But I can certainly vouch for this program, and it's a great initiative from the Victorian Government. It's helped participating companies help themselves by sharing their experiences and developing ways to improve their businesses. And it's an example of a great and frankly inexpensive government program. It delivers tangible results, and while it's not going to make the front page of the Australian or be big news on the ABC, it's the sort of program that we can do a lot more with, and that we can learn a lot from. It's a 2-year program, and 18 manufacturers from Bendigo participated in it. I won't list them all, but the experiences and the examples from those companies who were involved were that they learnt an enormous amount from each other and as a group. And those shared experiences, the sort of peer-to-peer learning, are where industry can learn most. And they're the sort of cases and examples where we think government has a key role to play. We say that those sort of programs have a big role in getting things moving when the economy resumes sort of normal transmission. Karen Andrews mentioned the Entrepreneurs Program, another fantastic program that a lot of businesses in Bendigo have taken advantage of, and which we've run on behalf of government, again helping businesses lift and elevate themselves to the next level. What I like about these programs is that they put forward real-world problems and provide real-world solutions. And that's very important. We have to keep things grounded here. We have to keep things in the real. So I think really we have enormous opportunity here. And what I'd just like to lastly turn to is this notion of self-sufficiency, what some people are now starting to call, or we're starting to call, smart sovereignty. And this is sort of comes to the issues around reshoring, bringing business back to Australia, and sort of doing much more for ourselves. There are some industries, of course, that we want to have here, that we need to have here. Defence is a key one. Developing as a new one will be space as well, a key industry that we want to have here. But the pandemic has also highlighted other vulnerabilities. Karen Andrews talked about Medcon, but there are vulnerabilities in medicines and health equipment, for instance. And we need to now look at our vulnerabilities as we come out of this pandemic. The same goes for our fuel supplies. What do we do about our domestic refining capacity in Australia. But while there are some particular arguments for particular areas, we can't set out to make ourselves completely self-sufficient or even mainly self-sufficient in everything. We have a lot to gain from trade. We have a lot to gain from exporting. We want to be exporters, but we also have a lot to gain from importing as well. I don't want to see us revert to being an inward-looking protectionist nation. I want us to invest in our capabilities and to help our businesses to develop and to look outward with confidence. We do have to manage risk, and some of those risks were made clear to us through the early stages of the pandemic. But self-sufficiency is one way to manage those risks. And I'm sure every manufacturer on this call today has been spending the past few months looking at the dependencies on their supply chains and recalibrating. In some cases, the response may well be to bring it all or some of it back home, but not in all cases and maybe not even in most cases. Now, I haven't got to a lot of areas that perhaps we might want to talk about in Q&A, which are impacting on Bendigo, things like training, skills, education, energy and climate, that discussion, the investment in infrastructure, trade, immigration, industry development more broadly, taxation policy, and of course workplace relations. All of those we could talk for a very long time, and I'm happy to take any questions on those. But I'd just like to finish up by saying these are difficult times for many people in business. There are an enormous number of businesses out there struggling, and there are an enormous number of businesses who unfortunately won't make it through to the other side. We've seen the numbers on JobKeeper, for instance. 60% of companies on JobKeeper are in Victoria by the December quarter. 17% of employed workers in Victoria aren't doing any work at the moment. We'll see tomorrow the current account figures, which will show our economy contracting somewhere between 7 and 10%. So we shouldn't sugarcoat it and say these are easy times and she'll be right, mate. But there is enormous opportunity for us to come through the other side with a revamped, different-looking, more resilient, most self-reliant economy. And that's what we should be aiming at. And innovation in regional centres like Bendigo is going to be a key part of that renaissance of industry in Australia. I'll hand it back to you, Jonathan, and then happy to take any questions. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks so much, Innes. Innes is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Industry Group, and thank you very much. Innes, if it's okay with you, I think we might go straight to the panel rather than go with some questions that I've huge amount of jotting has gone from what you've been telling me, and I'm sure other people do too. So don't forget, we will be having a chat to our panel now for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and then we would very much like to see you part of the conversation as well. So let me introduce you to some people that I know more from their participation in national news and current affairs, rather than being part of a regional forum like the Bendigo International Invention and Innovation Festival. So this could be your chance to ask a question of three leaders of three major national industry groups, and you know how to do it. You did it in the shout out, do it again, type a question here. Well, Innes Willox is Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, and I'm not going to say anything more, we've met you already, but also Christine Gibbs-Stewart is CEO of Ostmine, welcome. And Michael Sharp, joining us from his car outside Queanbeyan, is the National Director for Industry at the Advanced Manufacturing Group. Michael, welcome. Extraordinary. There you go about regional infrastructure. Who would have thought 5 years ago you could do a national conference sitting in a car on a country road?
Very true. They say we've seen about 5 years worth of innovation in the last 5 months, and I think that's fairly accurate.
It is. Michael, I'm going to pick on you to begin with, if that's okay. And because we've been talking a lot about just how diverse manufacturing is, can you give us a little definition between what we know as manufacturing and what your shtick is, advanced manufacturing?
Oh, sure. So we say that advanced manufacturing is much more than just making stuff. It's not what you make, but how you make it. And rather than just me talking about it, we've actually launched Australia's first manufacturing academy. And that's open to anyone in the public to get on board and have a look at that platform where you'll see we've been interviewing our members from manufacturing companies, big and small, right across Australia, and they're sharing their own story about how they're being more advanced and developing new technologies and new ways of going to market. So more than just making stuff, an increased focus on such things as research and development. And, we've got some of the greatest minds in research in the world right here in Australia. And so being able to connect professors and other researchers to industry is a key driver, and it's a privilege of mine to take some of these people out to the factory floor and meet the industry leaders and see how we can look at new innovations in manufacturing today. More than production, it's things like logistics and supply chains. And it doesn't have to be that difficult either, Jonathan. We've got many events we've been putting on, and at a recent event, we had a couple of companies there talking about some issues with supply chains and getting transport needs from regional sites. In this instance, it was from getting to Armidale and Tamworth up to Brisbane, ready for export. And one of the companies said, we just can't get the trucks on time. We have troubles around negotiating and all the rest that goes with it. The other company owner said, well, look, I've got my own trucks. I'm only just down the road from you. Why don't we work together? And so collaboration is certainly a key driver for manufacturing, and we're seeing much more of that, and that's advanced. I guess finally I'd raise the point around the sales and marketing. And because I travel all over the country and I'm able to see some of the work going on in this field, I know there's a lot of room for improvement in the sales side of things. And one of the regional manufacturers in Cairns, a company called Norweld, developed an Instagram page. And Instagram, as we know, is completely free. You can be as creative as you like. But out of Norweld's Instagram feed, they've developed a global market just from posting photographs of their work. They build ute trays for the back of Toyota Land Cruisers and pop-out campers for trucks and things like that. They're now exporting globally because people have been able to see those products online and phone through and say, will you send me one? And they are. So this is advanced manufacturing today.
That's extraordinary. Basically, a hashtag on an international platform like Instagram, and suddenly you're not just talking locally, you're talking to anyone with a mobile phone.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
So true.
Something that Ines touched on, and you kind of touched on as well, is the profile of manufacturing in Australia. If you ask the average person, I think they'd say we're really good at tourism, really good at mining. The stuff in between, maybe agriculture as well, but the idea of making stuff just doesn't seem to be in our psyche.
Yeah, you'll hear the term Industry 4.0. That's the term you'll hear a lot of, but what does it mean? And so I like to take people back to Industry 1.0, the first industrial revolution. And we've got several large family companies in Australia that have been around a long time. One of those companies is a group called the Varley Company based in Newcastle. They've been around since George Varley formed the company 132 years ago, and he formed that company to transform sailing ships into steam-powered vessels. And so steam power changed the world as we knew it. It was a step change like we'd never seen before, and yet we all had to adapt. And those companies are still trading today. To Industry 2.0, and think about Henry Ford and mass production. So again, a massive change in the way that manufacturing happened, and all about this mass production and getting products out to a wider audience. And at that time, people said, what are we going to do now about the local jobs? If we're going to streamline manufacturing and make it more advanced, aren't we going to see all these job losses? And I think we hear a lot about that today. And yet we did adjust, and the smart companies did adapt to new ways of doing things, and they're still thriving today. Industry 3.0, or the third industrial revolution, pretty much when I was at school. Computerization and everything that came with that. And, I remember my teachers at school saying, you guys are going to have it so good with this new thing called the internet and with computers. You'll probably only work a 3-day week. So I'm not sure how that worked out for everyone, but again, we did adapt. And at the time, Bill Gates put out a book called Business at the Speed of Thought. And so email was going to change the way we did business. And we had the Y2K bug to adjust to. So we've been through many crisis times before, of course, which brings us today, which is the digital transformation of manufacturing, Industry 4.0, this fourth industrial revolution, and things like robotics and automation and smart sensors and the technology that we can incorporate. rather than taking away jobs, the companies that I visit and the companies that I talk with around the robotics side of things are growing. They see the robots as increasing their quality, certainly improving workplace safety, and being able to grow the business and look at those broader opportunities. So that's manufacturing today.
Michael, it's interesting. I absorb too much media to remember exactly where I see things, but I saw someone saying that introducing robots into their manufacturing actually increased the number of jobs that they had. For every robot that they brought in, I think they said they had to hire one other person.
Yeah, you've got manual handlers who are now learning to work with the robots, and so they're really becoming robotics technicians. So we're seeing this upskilling of the workforce, being able to maintain local jobs in regional areas, and being in a more smart way of building local companies. This is the future for our sector, and we say much more than just being an industrial sector. Manufacturing is really a nation's capability. What are we capable of making? What are we capable of producing and exporting to the world? How can we boost our nation's productivity? And manufacturing certainly plays a key role in that.
Excellent. Christine Gibbs-Stewart, if I can ask you a couple of questions. You're CEO of Ostmine. First of all, perhaps a very basic question. Where do you see mining fitting under the umbrella of manufacturing?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for having me here. When Paul contacted me about the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival, I jumped at the opportunity because I think the theme of optimism through innovation is spot on at a time like this. And the other thing about it is that the MET sector, so the mining equipment, technology and services sector, which Ostmine represents, is one of the most innovative sectors in Australia. So back to your question, one thing that you mentioned is that we're really good at mining, and Ines talked about, off the back of mining. Well, in fact, we're so good at mining because of manufacturing, because of the technologies that we've developed right here in Australia through manufacturing from manufacturing firms that have really helped our mining industry to be the world leader it is today. And it's really been a parallel development of our mining industry and of our manufacturing sectors or manufacturing industry, and the symbiotic relationship and the close coupling of both that has enabled mining to be, again, a world leader and as productive. And off the back of that, we've spawned this highly innovative industry, which is the MET sector, again, mining, equipment, technology, and services sector, which we're really proud of, which we're really world leaders, and where being from Australia is certainly a hallmark of success.
And Christine, you've already argued that people came for the gold in Bendigo, and the first businesses that were set up in Bendigo were the original METS sector here in Victoria, here in Australia.
Well, we did a survey of METS companies, and we found that the oldest METS company is Victorian, and we traced that back a bit further, and it stemmed from Central Victoria and the gold rush in the 1850s, and that's where a lot of great technology started being developed. And if you look at who the METS companies are in Victoria, you have world-leading companies. The largest METS company is actually Orica, and they're headquartered in Victoria with many locations around Australia and around the world. You have companies like Caterpillar, who are headquartered also in Victoria. The list of well-known manufacturers goes on. Siemens is another one, which is in Victoria, which is a very active MET sector company. And then if you bring that down to more of a regional level, Ines mentioned before some of the manufacturing companies in Bendigo. Of course, Australian Turntable is one of them, and in the MET sector. But you have companies like Hoffman Engineering, Safe Escape, Keach Castings, who are all really great examples of very successful manufacturing companies who would be considered in the MET sector or who are part of the MET sector.
And of course, good, solid METS companies in Australia become good, solid METS companies globally. And I'll use a local example that I heard about recently. The Australian Turntable Company can quickly set up a turntable for a heavy truck in a mining situation. No more reversing, no more manoeuvring, saving a lot of time, health and safety implications, and that doesn't just work here, that works anywhere where there's a mine, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Met sector is one of the most internationalized sectors in Australia. Met's companies have been exporting since the late 1800s, started, looking into Southeast Asia and what was happening there in terms of mine, and then have taken their technology, services, and products to the world. We know that about 61% of Met's companies export. We export about $15 billion of goods and services each year. And if you look at that, that is more than the exports of beef, wheat, and wine combined annually. And while we hear about the export of commodities, we never really focus on the high value-added goods and services that we're exporting from Australia all over the world.
So in some ways, it's not just the Met's products, it's the Met's knowledge that is also critical in this equation.
Absolutely. I mean, I said before that being from Australia is a hallmark of success. It's a door opener. When you go overseas and you're talking to mining companies, to governments around the world. And in fact, many countries are trying to emulate what we've done here in Australia with our Met sector, recognizing that we pulled together, recognizing that we have set out to develop our capabilities on a global scale. And so they're seeking to do what we've done. And if you look at the Met sector as a whole, about 35% of Met sector companies are manufacturers. And so if you boil it down, that's really a core part of Met's is the strong manufacturing firms which we have.
It's interesting. A term I learned yesterday during the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival was cooperative competition. It sounds to me like that is what we're seeing within the Met sector, is that working together, creating a national and then international profile hasn't just happened by accident.
Absolutely. We know that collaboration is the key to success, and that's not only within the Met's companies themselves, but that's certainly between Met's and the mining companies. And what we've seen with the innovation ecosystem that we have spawned here in Australia, that there's been a high level of collaboration developed to where we have programs in place that we're talking about open innovation, where we're looking at different programs which put challenges up to the market, which people are responding to. So it's quite a vibrant ecosystem that we have here that's working to make sure that we continue to lead the world in mining and minerals.
That's extraordinary. This shouldn't sound so flummoxed, but I'm sensing that manufacturing, Met's and the whole sector has got in some ways a bit of a PR problem. I'm learning things about the significance of manufacturing to Australia where I would have thought, listening to some of our leaders, it was a thing that sort of was started fading away when we started to knock down tariffs, and we just don't make things in Australia anymore. And that's utter nonsense, talking to you three. Innes?
Absolutely, Jonathan. Look, manufacturing, if to put it very succinctly, manufacturing does have a PR problem and has had for some time. It's a problem around understanding capability. Look, there's still a perception among some people that manufacturing sawdust floors and handheld chisels and all that sort of stuff. It couldn't be further from the truth. But a lot of these sort of myths get perpetuated both through media, but also through a generational change. And part of the issue that we have is around trying to encourage or make younger people through the education system aware of the opportunities in manufacturing, the opportunities to participate in exciting things. So, Christine was just talking about mining really well, but I always remember when I was talking to Andrew McKenzie when he was CEO of BHP, he wouldn't call BHP a miner, he'd call BHP a manufacturer. Because it was a manufacturer of product and good, and it was in the supply chain. But people generally don't think of manufacturing as being opportunity or a growth sector or a sector where there is exciting innovation occurring. In fact, a quarter of Australia's R&D spend is in the manufacturing sector, which is, as I said, is about 8 to 9% of of our economy as a whole. So the focus on research, on development, on innovation, on change, on excitement, on doing things differently, on improving quality of life, all of that, or most of it, is generated out of the manufacturing sector. So there's a couple of issues here. We've got to do better as an industry around our reputation and our image. We've got to do better at schools. We've got to do better at careers counselling to make younger people aware of the opportunity. We've got to do better, as Michael was talking about, at collaboration with universities and others, which is where a lot of this works. We've got to do better with ourselves to get a better understanding of what Australia is. So I don't want to sort of labour the point anymore, but to say that we make amazing stuff here. We export to the world. It is the platform on which a lot of our economy works. Other sectors, mining, agriculture, all input into manufacturing in a big way. And this is the exciting bit about these times we're in. This is an opportunity to remake that image and to reimagine what manufacturing and industry is to Australia.
Ines, can I throw some words back at you from your conversation before we started this panel? You said, post-COVID, we want to continue to drag people from Melbourne to here. And on the other side, though, regional Victoria, and Bendigo is no different, and we're talking about an optimistic future for Bendigo, you'd say we have high unemployment, but also high job vacancy. And I wonder whether or not you've got a thought about how we need to think about inspiring and educating our own people, as well as bring skills in from outside.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Jonathan, and that goes to the opportunity that we have now. But I think Michael was sort of touching on it before, where we do have a skills gap in Australia. We've heard a lot about the conversation around STEM, science, technology, technical education and maths, and you can add into that STEAM with the A for arts and humanities and the like. We do have skills gaps that we can all readily identify, and it's a common lament from businesses that they can't get the people they need to do the jobs that they have. And that's still to this day, at a time of high unemployment, is that we have the skills gap. So we have an issue here where we're training, teaching, directing our young people and even people in mid-career into areas where we don't have the jobs growth, where we don't have the opportunities. So this is a big reset that we have to have around getting people with the right skills into the right places at the right time. So Bendigo and other regional centres are really no different to any other centre. Melbourne, Sydney, etc. There are skills gaps in those places as well. This is the opportunity for a centre like Bendigo at a time where people are looking for change. They've had time to reflect on their lives and what they're doing, how they're bringing up their children, all those sort of things. This is an opportunity for Bendigo to reach out to those people, to bring them in, and for them to then to contribute to the local economy in a huge way.
Christine from Ostermeyer, I notice you nodding sagely there as well. Is skills shortage also well, I was going to say impediment, that's a bit unkind, but a potential barrier to development in your industries?
It certainly is. I mean, there's a number of new skills required, particularly around the digital space. There's a real transformation happening in manufacturing where manufacturers aren't selling their products because of what they make, but it's the smarts of what they apply to their product that makes it unique. So as an example of that, there's a company in Victoria that makes dump bodies, which are basically the back of the big trucks you see in mining. And what they're looking at doing now is not only making those dump bodies, but adding sensors to that. So you can tell what is in the truck. You can tell the size of the rocks in the truck. You can tell the density. You can tell what minerals are in that truck. And those sensors feed back to a data center so that you can better process those minerals. And all those skills and different ways of looking at manufacturing and applying those different technologies, we certainly are lacking those skills. But I would say one thing, that it's really an issue of young people not knowing what is available. they don't think of manufacturing in a more modern sense because we don't talk about it in a more modern sense. It's not taught in a more modern sense. They don't realize the careers and opportunities that they can avail themselves of in manufacturing. They have no idea that if they like gaming, in their leisure time, that they can take that into a manufacturing shop floor and be involved with that as a career. So I think we need to do a better job in communicating to young people what careers are available and what that looks like for their future.
It's bizarre to me that we're talking about an optimistic future for manufacturing in a regional city at an invention and innovation festival, yet we can start talking about career counselling at schools. And the fact that there was a review in Victoria just a few years ago saying the teachers who do the counselling don't understand the new world. It's not go to university, young person, and get a degree. It should actually be saying, look at the options that you have around you, and what you enjoy doing can be transferred into manufacturing, into agriculture. It can be anywhere. So, yeah, interesting to come back to that, isn't it? Can we go now to that opportunity perhaps for regional centres like Bendigo in the area of export as well? We've heard anecdotally at least that the Australian-made concept is still strong overseas. Do people like Australian products?
Oh, I would say absolutely, Jonathan. I mean, it doesn't matter where you travel in the world, people love Australians. They respect us as Aussies. And I think that goes for the products that we can export as well. We've got this fantastic trust value, which we all share that brand, Australia. And so the opportunities for things like food production, if we can get the packaging right and the sales and marketing improvements that I'm talking about, I think we've got a wonderful opportunity to increase our exports and hence the manufacturing base here in Australia. There's never been a better time as far as I'm concerned.
And Christine, you've already talked about how significant the international market is to Australian Mets, but anecdotally, talking to your members, do you find that just being Australian actually does help with the conversations with international firms?
Absolutely. As I said before, being from Australia is a hallmark of success. It opens doors because countries look at us to see what we're doing in the mining industry, and we know that they know we do it well. We're world leaders. And so they say, we want some of that. We lead delegations overseas each year. We take about 5 to 6 delegations, not so much this year, but certainly in past years. And doors are flung open. They want to know what's going on in Australia, and they say to us, well, we don't know what we don't know. And so, and we know that if you're from Australia, you know what we're doing. So we're all ears. We're here to listen.
That's brilliant to know. Ines, can you pour any water on that? Are there any downsides of being on the other side of the world as an innovative manufacturer?
It's a good question. I think it makes us work harder and it makes us be more resilient because we are a long way away. We're not the furthest away, but we have a relatively complex economy. Now, we look at New Zealand, and New Zealand is fantastic at what they do with a particular focus around dairy, lamb, sheep, agriculture-based. Australia is a very much more complex economy, but we're in the same part of the world, and that comes from our size, comes from our history, comes from our geography. But we have to work harder at it. We have much more to sell. Now, that's an advantage and a disadvantage because you look at a country like New Zealand, it's known for a couple of things and doing a couple of things really well. We have much more complexity within our economy. But through that complexity, we also have much more opportunity. So we do have to travel far. So in my old life, I was a diplomat. I was based on the west coast of the United States, 40,000 Australians at that time working and operating in what is now the world's 5th biggest economy of California, doing all sorts of quite amazing things from the creative space through to small business, through to technology, through to aviation and defence, etc., etc., etc. We bring a lot to the world. We have 2 attributes which aren't our best. One is tall poppy and the other is hiding our light under bushels. So we're sometimes a bit shy about it and a bit shy around what we can and do bring to the world. And if you think on a macro level, some of the great inventions that we've taken to the world, Wi-Fi, black box, etc., etc., etc. We Australians have fundamentally changed the world and the way we live in it. Goes down to the cement mixer being an Australian invention as well. So we fundamentally changed the way the world works. So there is no downside. The only downside is ourselves, really, that we're not prepared to talk ourselves up. Not that that's really in our nature, but we sometimes are prepared to talk ourselves down, which is to our detriment. And to your question, there are 1 million Australians working overseas, and overseas they love Australians. So ipso facto, they love Australian products because of what Australians bring to the table.
Ines or Michael, I'm not sure who might be able to answer this then, is that you mentioned, Ines, black box and Wi-Fi as terrific Australian inventions, but we heard yesterday in one of the sessions that in some ways the innovation to move them into big industry happened outside Australia. Do you think there will be the opportunity for the next big thing to not just be invented here, but also innovated here, and all of the benefits of an Apple or a Google coming back to Australia?
I'll go first, Michael. I think there's two concepts I'll use here. One is scale, is that we lack scale quite often. We have a lot of and figure Michael's organisation, mine, use all the time is that 90% of Australian manufacturers employ 20 or less people. So we have a scale issue to sort of build up capacity. So that's one issue. The second issue, and through that comes finance as well, being sometimes difficult in the Australian context, not ready access to venture capital and the like. The second thing is commerciality and commercialisation, and we suck at it. We're not good at commercialising our innovation, essentially, and that sort of that leap from the R to the D is sort of not a leap for many Australians. It's a valley, and sometimes we find that very difficult to traverse. And that's one of the big challenges in this period ahead, is to convert that innovation into commercial outcomes.
Christine, you're nodding, so I'm going to steal Christine before you, Michael. Do you find that with any of the organisations in your group as well, Ostmind, that maybe we come up with a great innovation, but it has to be developed elsewhere?
Yes, we do, and I would agree with Ines in terms of not being good at commercializing technology. But we are getting better, and there's a lot of programs now for startup companies, whether that's accelerators. There's one, for instance, in Victoria, in central Victoria, for Met's companies, a regional accelerator, to help companies bring their ideas to market. But more work needs to be done in that space. More investment needs to be done in that space. It also goes back to education, universities, and how we're educating, the entrepreneurs of tomorrow.
Okay, and Michael?
Well, I think, as Christine says about the ideas as well, it always comes down to collaboration in my book, and there's such an opportunity for us all to work stronger together. There's some great platforms out there that people might not be aware of, like the Centre for Optimism. If you get onto that site, there's some wonderful interviews with business leaders and others sharing their experience about how they're building their business and some of the success stories around that and what role optimism plays. Another site, which is growing by the day, is Idea Spies. And this is a platform where people can publish their idea and have it ranked by their peers and members of the public. So to look at how their idea might be able to go out to the world. I mentioned earlier about the Manufacturing Academy. Recommend that people get on board and have a look at that site. But one of our members is a company called Omnitanker, and they've developed technology and manufacturing skills around building chemical road tankers that go on the back of the massive trucks up and down our highways. With a project that we've been able to co-fund, they now have their third Omnitank on the ship heading to the United States. And they're collaborating with one of the US trailer manufacturers. So this is collaboration and technology and scale in action, because we'll be building those chemical road tankers here in Australia, exporting to the United States and fitting them to a United States-built trailer, which will hit those highways and byways right across the massive market of the United States. So I think collaboration will be the driver.
Extraordinary. I better let everyone know this is the 10th Bendigo Innovation and Invention Festival. Our guests this morning are really talking about an optimistic future for regional manufacture, and I guess Christine Gibbs-Stewart from Ostmine, Ines Willix from the Australian Industry Group, and Michael Sharp, the National Director of Industry with the Advanced Manufacturing Group. We've been speaking for about an hour so far. As I told you, time would fly when we're talking about massive areas, and one we haven't even touched on yet is actually government and industry collaboration, so we'll touch on that in just a moment. But might go to a couple of questions because people have been using the Ask a Question opportunity. Here's one, and I guess that you might know Jim Danek, Jim Danek from the Australian Industry Group. Local innovation developed the Bushmaster and Hawkeye vehicles for the Australian Army and is now exported to the world. How to attract not only the manufacturing jobs to Bendigo, but the innovation and product development skills. So that gets back to that education idea. Ines, do you want to throw one in there?
Well, I think it's interesting. Once you've had a starter like Talus, to use that example, that has then spawned a supply chain. And when I was talking to Chris Jenkins at Talus recently, I think he was saying that I had 122 local suppliers from into that plant at Talus, and most of them were regional Victorian as well. So that then is driving innovation through supply chains, and quite often you see the innovation work its way up rather than sort of spawn out. So from the suppliers, for a variety of reasons, drive innovation, and where you get a lot of innovation more generally is from small companies. Some of it's for survival, some of it's just new product development, some of it's serendipity. But I think what we have now is the opportunity to develop the innovative capacities of regional centres here as part of supply chains into businesses more broadly. And I think businesses, you might think of global businesses or big national businesses, I think overall will be much more prepared to look at regional centres as outlets because of the employment availability there, the access to land, access to capability more generally. Relationships with universities is something which I touched on earlier. All of that is sort of slowly but surely changing thinking around development of innovative capacity within regional centres. So Talus is a fantastic example because it became both a two-way feeder and user of innovation as part of that process, which has saved countless of Australian lives. And it's just a phenomenal example of Australian innovation that's gone global, but from a regional centre. And we have lots of examples like that. I think where the opportunity now is to get many, many more.
Excellent.
So can I just make a comment about
Please do.
that? So you really got to create a community, and you got to create an energy of people that want to be together to innovate, to come together and create a manufacturing center. And you do that both organically and inorganically. So organically, it grows from the companies that might be on the ground, and then inorganically, you have to make the investment in the various tools that will provide that atmosphere that people can come together and innovate. And that's things around education, developing skills, and it even goes to things like arts and crafts, sports, and what's happening socially in that community. And you often think about places like Silicon Valley and how that came to be. It's created an energy of its own. It's attracted people because of the other people that were there. And so, a place like Bendigo has a very, very good foundation already established. From a Mets point of view, it has some of the leading Mets companies there. It has other manufacturing companies there. It's dealing with other industries and really focus on creating that community around innovation. And getting a really good energy, I think, into the city will go very far in terms of driving the innovation, driving the skills, and driving young people to want to be there.
Excellent. Michael?
I just think the skills is so important. I say that it's not our grandfather's manufacturing anymore. We're not seeing the smokestacks. The places that I visit, some of them you could eat your lunch off the factory floor. So it's high-skilled, more advanced manufacturing. I guess one example would be that pretty much if you can operate a PlayStation today, you can get involved with robotics welding. It's that easy. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to share the innovation that's going on in manufacturing, to share the stories of the business leaders and how they're transforming their business. We need to encourage people about what manufacturing is today if we're going to get this next generation involved in our industry.
Okay, I'm going to try and bring 3 questions and comments into one, because I think the talk about finding people with the enthusiasm and skills to enter manufacturing has hit a nerve. So Anne, Tam and Peter have all kind of asked the same question along the lines of what high level and operational strategies could be considered to engage the interest of senior secondary school leavers to seriously consider a pathway. And Tamara is asking, careers in manufacturing, are there examples of how you're engaging young people successfully? And Peter's saying, what's the recruitment and training plan for manufacturing, advanced manufacturing? And he'd like to hint that Bendigo's creating one with their REAM roadmap, which we're doing a session on during the festival. So sounds like maybe this is a key area that someone has to come out and start tapping young people, old reskilling people on the shoulder and say, manufacturing, everyone.
I think it's a great opportunity. I was just going to say, I think it's a great opportunity in us to see the upgrade in skills that we can have. Gone are the days when you could go to work with your old man and help sweep the factory floor or talk to the older guys. I think the world has certainly changed with workplace safety rules and all the rest that go with it. So it's not as perhaps accessible as it used to be to bring the young people into the workforce. So we need to find new and innovative ways of doing that. I know that one of our members is a small family business at Bega on the south coast of New South Wales. And one of the fellas there has been there for over 40 years, and he's trained, over that time, he's trained 5 different apprentices. And he gets a great thrill out of being able to do that. When I was there recently, their latest apprentice, a young girl straight out of school, has just started with this business. So a local job opportunity for her. And with this fellow, with his years and decades of experience, he's looking forward to the mentorship and all the advice that he can offer. And as he said in his own words, the technology that's available now is just incredible. And so the opportunity for upskilling and creating new opportunities is quite vast. I think that's the sort of things we need to do, though, is look at these opportunities to entice more people to look at our industry. And it's great to hear about the program that you described at Bendigo. There's other programs that are being looked at where Year 11 and 12 students can complete their HSC whilst working at local manufacturing firms. But I know there needs to be an increased focus into this.
It's interesting, sorry, just my anecdote now, speaking to an engineer who did some research saying that the biggest indicator of whether or not someone would enter into engineering or manufacturing was whether they grew up with a shed they could tinker in when they were a kid. I don't know whether or not that parental side of things is important as well, Michael.
I mean, I just think that's what has been lost, is that opportunity for teenagers to go to the work sites and listen to the old hands about how they've shaped and crafted their own careers. Those days have gone by the wayside. So we need to find new ways to share those stories, show the experience and what sort of a career you can build for yourselves. I think we all know that today's generation are going to have so many different job opportunities and not hang around so much in their career like we've seen in the past. So if we're going to have these multiple job directions and changes in our careers over the decades, we need to find new ways of sharing that experience to bring new people into the sector. Excellent. Absolutely.
I'm going to have my Tony Jones moment here and say I'll take that as a comment rather than a question, and the question's gone. That's all right. It was basically, though, saying, wow, I didn't know anything about so many industry examples you're giving us. We need a publicity campaign funded by the government to highlight it. I kind of agree. I've also got a question from Peter, who I think is based in the US, and he'd like Innes to perhaps expand on the idea that there are 1 million Australians overseas, and whether or not that is actually an issue of brain drain of talented Australians leaving to go and work with Google, Tesla, Apple, etc., while we in Australia should be having those opportunities to use those innovators.
Okay, it's a good question. I'll come back to it in 1 minute. Just one thing on education. school leavers are too late. We need to get to young people sort of at year 8 and 9. That's when people are really starting to make decisions about directions of career. So if you put a group of my members in a room, we can talk all day about tax and climate and everything else. But if you really want to get them animated, you talk to them about skills, training, and the education system goes off. Because trying to attract young people in is devilishly difficult. So if I could do one thing in my time, that would be to completely change the focus of careers counselling at schools. Because the outcome of careers counselling is to get kids into a university course rather than into a career, as their job indicates. So that's something that we need to look at. And I can just say that there is, at government level, federal government level, when I'm talking with them, there is a big focus on this at the moment. There's also a big focus on around the image of manufacturing. So if you said to a young person, do you want to work in the space industry, they wouldn't necessarily think of that as being in the manufacturing area, but it is. Going to the brain drain, great question. We benefit from migration both ways. We benefit from a big pool of skilled migrants who come into Australia to give education, training, learning, mentoring to the workforce. So we're a big beneficiary of migration. It leads to things like increased housing, all of those sort of flow-on benefits as well. That's why you're seeing housing numbers contract as they are, new house builds contract as they are, probably about half of what they were this year compared to last, is because of the migration impact. So it works both ways. The brain drain is an interesting question. The trick here is to get people to go out and to learn, to those sort of companies that you mentioned, the Googles, the Teslas and the like, and all sorts of other companies in other spaces, but then to attract them back so you don't lose them forever, so that they can come back and in a way become skilled migrants themselves back into the country. A skilled migrant with Australian characteristics is how I'd put it, so that they can come back. And that's where issues around tax, around job abilities, around wages, all of those sort of things come into play, because people get inflated or different expectations when they work overseas. And this is where a centre like Bendigo has a real opportunity, because to attract people, say, with those sort of skills to a centre, they're quite likely wanting to come back, not to move to another city, but to have a lifestyle change. And that's a big opportunity for regional centres to attract people with those talents in. But the point here is, if they don't go away and develop those skills and those attributes, then they don't have the opportunity to come back and contribute in a more significant way. So going away in itself is not the issue. In fact, it should be encouraged in many cases. It's the bringing them back is the tricky part.
Christine, I'm guessing from your accent that perhaps you are one of those people we brain drained from North America to Australia. So maybe you'd have a perspective on this idea of swapping talented people from one country to another, whether permanently or to develop skills and go home and contribute to your own home economy?
You know, I think in general we have a very mobile workforce, and we're very lucky to live at a time where our talents and skills can take us anywhere in the world. A Met sector career is a very international career, and most people will describe that as part of their career. They've either lived somewhere overseas to progress their career, or they do a lot of traveling. And I think, you know, it's a two-way street. We have people that leave Australia, might come back, might not come back, and we have people that come here to contribute. And I think what the pandemic, though, is going to do for the workforce is that we'll be even more mobile than ever. We'll be able to work in different time zones in different ways and not have to be there. So really, where you live in the world might not make a big difference in the longer term.
Excellent. I'm going to come back to education again, because Louise has asked the question, manufacturing continues to be male-dominated, and you could argue that will actually exclude 50% of talented potential workers just in that sentence. But, you know, what can industry do to attract and recruit and retain more women into the trades in manufacturing? And I'm thinking everything from apprentices right up to management. I'm going to throw it to you first, Ines.
Again, it's a good question. And it's a question that sort of bedeviled the sector, not just manufacturing, but construction and other parts of business as well have had this same issue, engineering more generally. So I remember talking to a member back in the good times earlier this year who didn't fulfil their entire graduate intake because in an engineering company because they just didn't have enough women apply for the roles. So they went without because the way they perceived it was they wanted more women because it impacted positively on their culture. It changed the way they thought, they looked at issues, the way they addressed problems, and it gave a whole different perspective, a whole different look to issues. And as another CEO said to me, what's the point in playing the game if you leave half the team off the field? And, so there is a big push from industry to try to get more women in and contributing to the sector. Again, this comes back to schooling and perceptions of industries that is put around at school. So what I think it's a basic thing that industry can do is to get greater connectivity, if possible, with schools in their area to show the kids what's possible, what's achievable, not just at Company X, but beyond Company X as well. So to fire up their imagination. The other big problem is parents, and I always remember Paul O'Malley when he was running BlueScope and I having a conversation about this, and he said whenever up at Port Kembla they'd have a female apprentice graduate, they'd appear on the front page of the local paper, the Illawarra Mercury, with their hard hat on, and he said they would invariably say two things. One was, "This is the best decision I've made in my life. I'm loving every minute of it." And the second was, Dad told me not to do it. And that's an issue as well, around parental perceptions as well. So industry's got to help itself in what happens once people get into the workplace and to help women with career progression as they go. That's very important. That's probably new to a lot of industry to think that way, but it has to be done to entice women into the workplace, and then we have to work better and smarter at getting women interested in going into industry as well. This comes back to the big perception question that we touched on earlier, and if the perception of manufacturing is difficult generally, it's particularly difficult for women. So we need to change those ideas and to make it very clear that it's an exciting, innovative space. And so there's a lot of work to be done here. It's an enormous amount of work, and we're probably overturning generations of culture in many ways, but it's a challenge that we have to take up.
Michael, you mentioned how giving young people a chance to talk to the old-timers could be a way of inspiring them to enter manufacturing. Is that also a double-edged sword? Because sometimes the old-timers do have a very different view of what the workforce should be like to the 21st century.
Well, I think Innes is right when he talks about the perception, and we do need to share the stories about manufacturing today to show people what a broad base that it is and what a wonderful opportunity that manufacturing can offer. As a nation, we've recently signed the NASA Moon to Mars mission, and so we're building local supply chains here in the Australian space sector to be part of that mission. One of our members is a company called Hakko Watchers. They're the only watch manufacturer in Australia, and they do it very, very well. They've got some fabulous equipment for making very small and intricate parts in these wonderful timepieces. And when I reached out to them, they said, why can't we be part of making satellites and other complex parts of equipment? We'd love to be part of the space industry. And so if we can share those stories and show what a broad opportunity there is in manufacturing in Australia today, I think we see more and more people lining up to say, can I be a part of it? I think that's what we all need to do.
We heard yesterday, I think, from the Australian Space Agency, they're planning a $700 million investment, looking hopefully for a $12 billion return in about 10 or 15 years. So there's certainly a lot of will to make those sorts of things happen. Christine, yeah. I suppose that I haven't got a clear answer yet about whether or not there is more to the potential barriers of women in manufacturing that Dad didn't suggest that I do it. Are there some cultural changes within manufacturing that need to happen where women feel welcomed and are treated equally?
Well, I've been working first of all, we're having the same conversation in mining in terms of attracting women into the mining industry. It has the same image, I guess, as manufacturing, that it's dirty, that it's not for women. But we can look around the met sector and you can look at some of the mining companies and, one of the richest women in Australia, Gina Reinhardt, who is leading a very successful mining company. I've worked in manufacturing businesses most of my career and heavy engineering. I started out my career actually selling pumps, burners, boilers, and valves to Latin America, and that was my beat. And I traveled there three or four times a year. And it was more believable that I worked for the CIA than I was speccing a boiler to put in a sugar mill in the middle of Guatemala. So it goes both ways in terms of people's perception of, who shouldn't be in the industry and who should be in the industry, and then it reflects back on who wants to work there. But I think, like anything, and I think as we've been talking about today, you need to educate people on what the opportunities are. I mean, manufacturing is not just about the shop floor. There's many, many other aspects to it. And as we digitize things, it is about the computers and maybe doing some work in the office and not so much on the floor. But what women are really looking for is, they're looking for equal opportunity. They're looking for some flexibility. They're looking for a supportive workforce. And if you can offer that and take it down to the individual company levels, then you shouldn't have any trouble attracting women to your business. And I think most, businesses these days are trying to put in place policies that will attract women to their companies. And so I think we'll see an increase in that. But I think as well, there's certain parts of manufacturing where women are very active and where I'm not going to say dominate, but for instance, in food manufacturing, and Michael, you might be able to comment on this, but many small food SMEs are owned and run by women. And so I think sometimes it's also a myth that women aren't involved in manufacturing. And maybe we have to tell some more of their stories.
It sounds like there's a lot of storytelling that needs to be happening as manufacturing not just continues to score runs, but it's a bit like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to see it, did it really happen? So extraordinary stuff. April sent a shout out to us, I think, from Denver in Colorado to begin with, and she's asked the question, which might be another I've hidden under a bushel, but asks, why are there not more partnerships between American and Australian companies involving research and development? And I'm expecting you to say, but there are. So, Ines, do you want to have a talk to that?
I'm happy to go first. Well, one of the other things I do, apart from my day job, is I sit on the board of the American-Australian Leadership Dialogue. So very heavily involved in relationships with the United States at a sort of a political business security level. You're right, Jonathan. I'll say there is probably more than we know of and give credit to. I've got to say, I'll make a couple of points. I've got to say American companies generally, sweeping generalisation I know, but when they come to Australia, they're very good, if not better, than local companies when it comes to collaboration with public sector institutions like universities or collaboration with other businesses. I think it's sort of more part of their DNA. And it's something that they do very well. So I'm thinking of partnerships, say, with companies like Dow Chemical or Boeing, for instance, who do Boeing's biggest plant outside the United States is in Melbourne, for instance, and they have very strong links, research and collaboration links resulting out from that. Dow has the same big, strong relationship up in Queensland, for instance. They're just two examples of many I could give you, but there are. And flowing back the other way, as I mentioned, there are a lot of Australians in the United States, but not all, but clearly, but a great proportion of that Australian work in the United States is sort of, if I call it, sort of more entrepreneurial or smaller. So those research links aren't there. But I was in San Francisco last year. Two things stood out. You drive into San Francisco. Well, this apart from going to Silicon Valley, which is where they almost speak Australian in parts of Silicon Valley, with the Australian R&D component there. But you go into San Francisco, you see the Atlassian office sort of stands out like a sore thumb as soon as you go there. Then you go to a company like Planet Labs, which you might have heard of yesterday, putting satellites into space, set up by Australians, run by Australians, Australian accents everywhere, R&D spinning off of that. There's a lot there. But again, as you were saying, Jonathan, it's not something we promote, we sort of overtly promote, but there is a lot going on and there is a lot of collaboration between the two countries. Now, this happens in a whole lot of different areas, and without sort of stepping onto a landmine here, you're probably likely to see that go up in the years ahead because of sort of global tensions, if I can put it that way. So that those sort of links will probably grow in the time ahead, and they'll be quite deliberately cultivated to build those ties. But we have deep and strong links with the United States in a business sense, in a collaborative sense, and probably more than we actually gives ourselves recognition for. The US is the biggest investor or an investor into Australia, for example.
So, Michael, a follow-up question for you from that is from Paul, who says, do we see any difficulties arising with US government protectionist policies for Australian manufacturers? So we've obviously heard the positives there, but the other side is, of course, it is a shifting strategic world, and people like to look after their own too, don't they?
Sure. Well, I mean, Australia has always been a trading nation, and we always will be. I think the relationship between Australia and the United States is one of our, great relationships that Australia's involved with. I mentioned the Omni-Tanker project, and so that's collaboration between US and Australian companies working together to get Australian technology on the roads across the United States. When COVID first hit, we had a company called Stryker Medical, a global US-based medical technology firm. They make hospital beds and much other med tech equipment. They needed support to build their hospital beds and saw Australia as an opportunity to partner with. And very quickly, we helped build local supply chains here in Australia, and we were producing hospital beds within weeks from their designs in the US, but with production capabilities here in Australia. And so the research side and the technology side had to be adapted, for example, from feet and inches to metric, but they worked together through day and night to do that. And out of that now, we have Foreshore Casters in Victoria exporting caster wheels made in Victoria and exported to the United States for global operations. These companies now working together who didn't know each other before, but are now looking for export opportunities just for hospital beds. So this is where collaboration does certainly play a key role.
Excellent. We've got about 25...
Jonathan, I was just going to have 2 seconds to think about other examples from the Australian end. So you think of Austal, the shipbuilding firm, building ships for the US Navy, Australian-based company doing that. You have Visy, huge presence in packaging in the United States. Aurora is the same. BlueScope has a big footprint in the United States. So Australian, they're just four more examples that quickly came to my mind just to illustrate the point that Australian businesses are going there in a big way, and from those they're getting themselves involved in local supply chains and local collaboration, local R&D, maybe not on the scale that we're used to or we hear of every day, but it's occurring. Just some quick examples there.
Okay. I was going to say the last 25 minutes or so, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about that other key foundation of a good manufacturing industry, that is government, and the role that government should or should not have in supporting manufacturing. And I'm going to start with the parochial. It's the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival, so I can say that we have our own Bendigo Manufacturers Group supported by the Council's Economic Development Unit. We've got other networks through our university and our technical high school to inspire young people in areas like manufacturing. But where should investment and say in manufacturing begin or end with government? Innes, I guess if I could start with you, what should manufacturing expect from government when it comes to trying to create a more vibrant and more valuable industry?
So we've got 25 minutes.
Actually, you've got 5 so that the other people can have a chat too.
I was only joking, don't worry. Look, this is a huge question, because this is, what do we expect from government? What is the role of government when it comes to developing, setting up, promoting industry? So just a few quick points. Government really has to set the parameters for industry to thrive. So you think about things like industry policy that I talked about in my presentation more broadly. Think about taxation policy. You think about regulatory burden. You think about the levels of government. You mentioned the Bendigo relationship with the council. You also have the state government layered on top of that, federal government on top of that. So you've got to work out what the regulatory burden here is. You've got to think about the settings around energy and climate policy. Are we a trading nation or are we a protectionist nation? Now, these are big sort of ephemeral questions that you ask, but government set the parameters around those sort of things to allow industry to operate. Then you get into the next layer about, well, what do we actually want to do in Australia? I mean, do we want to make everything? Do we want to play up to our competitive advantage, in mining, in agriculture, those sort of sectors? How hard do we want to push those? What new capabilities do we want to develop in the country? What do we need to have made here? So most recently we've had the questions around health, pharmaceuticals, vaccine. Okay, if a vaccine is developed, how do we actually deliver it in Australia? Do we have the capability to deliver it? And the federal government put out a request for information about 2 weeks ago on companies who can do the packaging, who can make vials, who can make needles, all those sort of things. So there's the different layers to this. What the parameters are, what do government think we can do, what do government think we should do, and then what space does government allow for business just to develop itself serendipitously? So without government sort of control or backing, so things just pop up. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought, I'm just picking a company, we wouldn't have thought we would have had an Atlassian in Australia. Well, government policy certainly didn't deliver an Atlassian. Atlassian developed Atlassian. So you have to create space for that. What are the rules around R&D to push collaboration, to push innovation in the country? What is government trying to push, and what room does it leave for serendipitous development? All those sort of issues. So really the role of government is to set the boundaries and the framework and to give industry the room to move and to grow and develop. And that's largely what we're looking at. And so you have those sort of big macro settings. So part of the conversation that's going on in Canberra at the moment is how much should be directed by government and how much should be left to industry. What areas does government push? We have the growth centres. Michael's involved in one. Are there room for others in things like plastics and chemicals? Waste is a huge area, for instance. China's banned taking our waste, and now we put export controls on our waste. That's an opportunity for a huge waste industry to develop in Australia. All of these things are sort of up for conversation at the moment as part of the rebuild of industry at the moment. So industry should expect government puts in place frameworks that allow them to compete locally and internationally, or not be uncompetitive locally or internationally, let's put it that way, and put in place frameworks to allow them to delve in, get support from programs like the Entrepreneurs Program, like other Bendigo, the Regional Clusters Program and the like, to help promote industry. But we can't expect government to tell industry what to do. That's central planning, and that doesn't work here. That's not what we want. But government just has to have the framework in place to allow industry to compete.
Now, if I recall, was it the CSIRO who recently released an industry framework that was talking about identifying 5 or 7 industry sectors and looking to invest in those areas? And I think, Ines, you probably touched on 2 or 3 what sound like brilliant opportunities like waste management. But Michael, is that the kind of thing also you want from government? Is that idea of not just a framework, but also if you are looking at helping us with some of our strategic or, I'll use that word, strategic problems, then we might be able to support you as well?
Well, of course, governments at all levels, state, local and federal, can be great customers too, right? And Ines mentions the waste sector, which I agree is a wonderful opportunity. and potentially every local council can be a manufacturing site with their garbage tips, using waste as a resource, and such things as 3D printing and recycling of plastic waste to put into the manufacturing supply chains is an outstanding opportunity that's there for us now. And so the federal government and state governments are working together on what's called the Recycling Modernisation Fund, which will turn out to be around $1 billion initiative for the recycling and circular economy. So there are opportunities there now. Think about governments as a customer. Look at the massive defence budget, some $270 billion, which is an opportunity for more manufacturers to look at getting involved with. And so we're actively trying to break down barriers and open up those doorways into defence so that companies big and small can harness onto that opportunity. We saw that back when the mining downturn and during the GFC, some of the local engineering firms looked out to the defence sector at that time to grow their business because the mining was turning down. They did that. They implemented new quality controls and created new relationships into defence. And then as mining turned back on, those companies lifted all as one. And so they employed even more people, and the companies have grown over that time. So I think government has a role to play in being an enabler as well. There's a great opportunity moving forward, absolutely.
Excellent. Joe, I'll get to your question in just a moment. But Christine, as you say, METS is not just a national manufacturer, it's actually an international one as well. Do you think that government could be doing more or less in your sector?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I agree with what Ines and Michael has said in terms of government being an enabler, being a supporter, but they sit in the back seat, not the front seat, and it's really up to business to drive the direction in terms of which it's going. There are, some regressive taxes in Australia that are really, should really be looked at. Payroll tax, I can't think of a more stupid tax to discourage people from hiring people. But I think, that's something that's been debated for a long time. Looking at things like incentivizing capital investment would really help, particularly regional manufacturers. And the other thing we've been talking about today is in the digital space. So what more can the government do to enable things like VR and AR and AI, and to help businesses really move into the digital age and do that quite successfully? But certainly when it comes to export, the government really needs to back us when we go overseas. The government has really stepped away recently from promoting or from supporting big international trade exhibitions. You have Germany there with 200 stands. You have Canada there with 200 stands. You have Switzerland there with 200 stands. And Australia just doesn't have the presence that some of those other countries do because the government isn't really backing us when we go offshore. Austrade does a great job, but we need more backing from government internationally. Can I also say, though, and I'll give a plug for our Export Hub program, we have just kicked off in Victoria a Victorian METS Export Hub, which is actually regionally based, and we'll be doing a lot of work in Bendigo, in Ballarat, in Stawell, etc. And I think initiatives like that to really unpack the capabilities of local companies, understand what the unique selling propositions are, and then matching that to opportunities internationally is a really good opportunity to take Australian companies to the world. So that's a very positive thing, but I still think government needs to back us more internationally.
So it sounds like they're doing well in some areas, could improve in others. It sounds a bit like a report card for school, doesn't it?
Yeah. And of course, it's a tricky time. I mean, with the pandemic, all the borders are closed, so exporters are really suffering at this time. But exporting is a long game. Relationship development takes a long time. And so if we're starting now when things are closed down and making those initial steps, making sure we're ready to go, putting in place plans, we'll hit the ground running when those borders open up.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Joe, we'd get to your question, and he's suggesting the federal government's research and development incentive policy seems to be in a bit of a mess. To what extent is this an impediment to innovation at the moment? And Christine, can I perhaps start with you on that one?
Well, I think I'll let Ines answer this one.
Hang on, to use the Australian term, you're going to handball that one to Ines?
I'm going to hand all of this to Ines, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. I just smiled when I read that question, Jonathan, because it is a mess. I've been doing this job now for almost a decade, and it's been a mess for almost a decade. The issue here is that it doesn't seem to be clear to government what they want from an R&D policy, what they want it to achieve. And, we've gone backwards and forwards, and we've had an attempt in the last attempt was the 2018 budget, which really went nowhere in the Parliament and has now been shelved. So the government's going back to it again as part of this budget deliberation. Whether we get anywhere or not is still to be determined. 6 weeks to go until the budget. But essentially what they've wrestled with from the start is I know I'm talking to Bendigo here, but what they perceive to be the misuse of R&D tax concessions by big miners and big banks. So that's largely what, and IT companies, that's really what they've been wrestling with and trying to work through. The incentive programs are all wrong as they now set up. Only a few companies benefit. Those who spend an inordinate amount of money on R&D benefit. So quite frankly, companies like Cochlear do benefit, and they're members of ours, but and so they're strong supporters. But other companies just miss out entirely because they don't have the R&D spend ratio at the required level, and who could if you're a smaller business? And that's the issue. So it's about trying to find that happy medium and to encourage particularly SMEs to become more MMEs, to scale up. And that's really what the challenge is here. We've just said to them as part of our budget submission to go back to the drawing board and to rework their proposals to really put a focus on developing SME research capability, because at the moment they miss out. So look, they've had this wrestle for years around how to do it. And in the meantime, we miss out on opportunities. It's something we need to get right. It is to the core of innovation. And then that leads to, we question why we don't get commercialisation outcomes. The R&D policy approach is a key part of the commercialisation failures. So
that's one of the key parts of the jigsaw.
I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, it's interesting. A former Victorian Premier, I remember saying, rather than give one grant of $5 million to one organisation and hope it does well, if you actually give 5,000 organisations $1,000, you never know, maybe the shotgun approach might be, or spreading the love. Creates the serendipity.
You don't want to be, that random, but, the concept is not that far wrong, basically.
Okay, fair enough too. Christine, you're going to be joining us this afternoon for a conversation about the future of mining as opposed to manufacturing. So you certainly do have feet in both camps. But obviously, one thing that I wonder whether we need to talk to you about is this idea of after the gold rush. And it seems to me from what you've been saying that our Mets industries are really good at saying, we'll set up, say, in Bendigo because there's a mining industry here. It might only last 30 years, but we will continue to manufacture, to innovate, and to be a part of our community for much longer.
Absolutely. Mets is really the sustainable legacy of mining itself. You look at other countries around the world which had a strong mining base a couple centuries ago, and they don't have mining there anymore, but they have major multinational companies who are still operating and who are world leaders in what they do. So what we're really doing is we're building a local community, we're building a local supplier base that doesn't only supply to mining, but can work in other industries as well. And what we know about the METS sector is only about 25% of METS businesses work 100% in mining. So they're a highly diversified sector, and we want that because of, the mining ups and downs. We don't want everyone 100% tied to mining. And if you look around in terms of what's happening and what METs are good at and what mining is good at, you look at things like smart cities. You look at maintaining large assets. We talked about space before. What we know about remote operations, what we know about maintaining capital equipment from afar, what we know about predictive maintenance, what we're doing with robotics and automations is highly applicable to the space industry and other industries. So what we're really, working towards in the MET sector is not just being a leader in innovation and technology in mining, but it's being a global leader in technology and innovation where industries come to us to understand what we're doing, and we can share with them our technologies so we can advance in other areas.
Terrific. All of you have mentioned this morning the idea of setting up supply chains, and Christine Jackson's actually singled you out for this question. Hopefully it's not a handballer. Can you tell us a little bit about mining or METS company procurement policies? Is there anything that can help make a regional company stand out? And I guess I'm throwing that there because yesterday there was a big conversation about it's all very well to have a vibrant regional community, but what if we could actually attract all of the services and suppliers to our region and not depend on Melbourne or Sydney sending that knowledge and equipment to us?
Well, I think regarding mining company procurement policies, each company is different, and procurement can often be the bane of people's existence because it's just so hard to crack. And in this day and age, I think regardless of whatever you're doing, it's really a people to people. It's really a relationship thing. So, what we espouse, and we've talked about it today, looking at collaboration, looking at being really networked, understand what your customers' strategies are for the future, where are they going with their technology roadmap, what are their needs. Don't go selling a product to someone when you don't know if they don't even need it, and that happens all the time. So I think it's really understanding your customers and being really networked, so you understand where your customers are going, what their strategies are, so you can better connect in with them.
Cool. Christine, also April, who's from Denver, has also been honing in on your conversation about mining, robotics and automation being part of the gold rush potential. Can it also be part of the rush or the rush potential for space and partnering? Again, April, you're picking on American, but I'll say global companies looking to explore other opportunities in terms of research and sustainability.
Absolutely. What we're doing here in Australia with automation, particularly in the mining industry, again, is applicable to a lot of other industries. We have the largest fleet of mining autonomous vehicles anywhere in the world driving around the Pilbara right now. We have automation in underground mines. And so, we're using things like drones and robots. So there's definitely a lot of areas and synergies where we can work together. And, Ines talked about some of the work that's going on right now, and there's many examples in the mining industry where American firms and Australian firms are working together.
Okay, and I suppose that you touched on that too, haven't you, Ines, that idea that an expert in one field of manufacturing actually has the potential to contribute in others, and the Australian Space Agency is a perfect example of that.
Well, absolutely. And that's been, I don't want to go political here, but that's been part of the conundrum that the state government had when it whitelisted companies as part of the COVID shutdown. And the point we made to them was, hang on, companies just don't work in one sector of the economy. They work across the economy in multiple channels, in multiple parts of the economy. So need to be very careful around trying to basically categorise things. And sort of one thing that's probably sort of run its race is the old ANZIC code for companies, which sort of locks you into one area. Businesses now work across multiple areas and take the technology they've developed and take it into other areas. So there's numerous examples of companies that move, say, from automotive to rail to water into defence, now into space, using the core technologies they've developed. And I think, it's not about we shouldn't think about sector anymore. We should think about technology more.
Okay. What I'm sensing from this panel is that Australian manufacturing does have a very optimistic future. Australians are great innovators. We are great inventors. But there are some things outside our control as well. And I think it was Stuart who raised the question about, for all of this, things like interest rates, almost the knowable unknown. They must also be some of the really big things that we need to, factor in when we're creating a vibrant future.
Well, there's a big question here. Interest rates leads to a conversation around money, which leads to a conversation around credit. So just for your benefit out there, I was talking with Anna Bligh, the head of the Bankers Association this week, and, the banks, and Anna made the point that 2 points, and they're related. One is that the number of applications for credit in the past 2 months from businesses has fallen quite significantly. I mean, who would want credit in this current scenario is sort of the argument. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that the number of rejections by financial institutions has gone up because businesses are trying to take on too much debt. So I don't know what the answer is there. I just give you that as an example of what's going on at the moment. So credit is a big issue. Interest rates, well, they're going to stay low for a long time. Phil Lowe, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, makes it very clear in conversations with him that he's got 3 years left of his term. And even a year ago, he was telling me he's not going to be increasing interest rates for the rest of his term. So interest rates will stay low for a long time. Tax, I know there's a question there around tax, is a big issue. Corporate tax rates. So 3 quick things on tax. Somebody asked, well, one is to reduce our corporate tax rate to 25% for all businesses. That's got to be an objective. Reduce income, or change the income tax scales to get more money into people's pockets, particularly for those earning under 90,000. Well, this is part of our budget submission, by the way. Christine's point around payroll tax is a really good one, perhaps the dumbest tax of all time. Economists like it because it's simple, but it is a tax on productivity and jobs, basically. And what you'll see, I suspect, is that one state will move as a result of this, and I'd put my money on New South Wales for big payroll tax exemptions going forward, and that will drag other states with them. And the final point is around simplicity, simplifying the system, the tax system overall, not just for business, but for public as well. Simplification is a big issue. The complexity is mind-numbing, and that's got to be, that is an outcome that we're pushing very hard for. So those sort of parameters are the sort of things that businesses think about when they think about competitiveness, and they see what's happening with overseas competitors and what they have to either do or not do compared to us. So it is always a comparative exercise.
But we still have an optimistic future.
Oh, absolutely. We have an enormous amount, Jonathan, to be optimistic about. We, as I said, are a very complex economy. We do a lot. We have an enormous number of competitive advantages, agriculture, mining, among others. We have a lot to work with and a lot to play with. And we're inherently smart people. We don't give ourselves the credit for it. That's why there's 1 million of us overseas, because people overseas love us and what we bring to the table. So there's every reason to be optimistic. There's every reason to be optimistic that coming out of this downturn, huge downturn, that we'll rebuild an economy which will look different but better, and with industry much more at its base. Brilliant. A lot to be optimistic about.
Thank you so much, Ines. I think they turned into a beautiful set of closing remarks for us. Thank you. Christine, anything to add as we head to wind up this seminar?
No, I guess, I think we're very fortunate and very lucky to be here in Australia. I mean, look around the world and look how the pandemic is hitting other countries. Look at what's happening in the United States in terms of social unrest there. Our economy, while, it's consistent, it's not hit too many snags. And with the application of technology, the smarts Ines was talking about, and how people are viewing things now and rethinking how we can do things, it is a very optimistic time for us. So everyone be safe and stay well.
Thank you very much. And we'll be talking again with you this afternoon when we talk about the future of mining in particular. So looking forward to seeing you again, Christine. And Ines, thank you so much for joining us too.
Thank you, and thank you all, and go well. And Bendigo's got a great future, and as we now have to say, stay safe, but go well too.
Thank you so much, Ines from the Australian Industry Group. And you probably noticed that Michael Sharp, unfortunately, technology at Queanbeyan didn't quite get us through the full 2 hours. He joined us from the Advanced Manufacturing Group, so thank you to our panel. And thank you, of course, for joining us. You can access the 2020 Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival app through your browser or your mobile device. There's probably another 74 sessions that you could be part of if you'd like to. And as I mentioned, join Christine to talk more about mining and the met sector this afternoon. And what else have we got for you? We'll be talking about how to introduce an exciting new program to assist Victorian METS organisations to conquer the world. And thank you again to Federal Minister Karen Andrews, who also mentioned the innovative work of MedCon in her opening speech. As part of the 2020 BIIF, on September 22nd, we'll be interviewing Peter Marks, who's the Director of FoodMac, and he'll talk about the behind-the-scenes story of MedCon in our Showcasing Innovation series. And thank you once again to our session partner, Bendigo Pottery, and to Idea Spies, Australian Manufacturing Growth Centre, the Australian Industry Group and AustMine. Find everything you need at the biif.com.au webpage, and remember our hashtag as you share your ideas with friends and colleagues, hashtag 2020 BIIF. 2 more sessions today, as I say, exploring Bendigo's new gold rush in 2 hours from now, and a little bit later this afternoon, in about 4 hours, we'll meet a woman in STEM and hear her story as an immigrant and that pathway into research and innovation. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you and goodbye.